solar and wind actually have become quite a bit cheaper over the last decade. So cheap that in many places where it's sunny and windy, they're actually cheaper than fossil fuels. But this is on a particular basis. This is what we call based on what's called the levelized cost of electricity, meaning if you take all of the money that you spend to create that resource and you divide it by the total amount of energy that you can get out of it, electricity you'll get out of it through its entire lifetime, that ratio can now be smaller than the case is for fossil fuels.
Our next guest, Dr. Asegun Henry, Associate Professor at MIT, may be one of the world's most important innovators and thinkers on solving our energy crisis and climate change problems.
You are watching Profonde TV with host Phyllis Haynes.
It is a pleasure today to have a chance to talk with you. You are a very busy scientist, so I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
You have made some very important video productions on the subject of science. So to begin, I'd like to know what is motivating your project called Ask a Scientist?
This is a good question. I think that the original motivation started during a period of time around 2011 when I was working at the Department of Energy. So I'm very big on working on technologies and things that can move the needle on climate change. And when I was working at the Department of Energy, it became clear to me that even if at that moment we had a technology that was cheaper than fossil fuels, provided energy to the grid, let's say, anytime we wanted it, with storage and all that, and all of that was cheaper than fossil fuels, that even if we had that technology at that moment, which we didn't, that would not be enough alone to mitigate climate change. Like there would not be some immediate movement to disseminate or proliferate that technology, and all of a sudden fossil fuel plants would get shut down. It's not that simple, and it became clear to me that there is a huge role for policy and politics to play in resolving climate change and saving our ability to exist on this planet. And I eventually became convinced that that's actually the majority of it, that even though my life is largely geared towards technology development, that's kind of falls within my expertise, the impact that policy can have is 10 or 100 times greater. And so even if I do successfully develop a technology that beats the cost of fossil and makes renewable energy a viable option and an alternative, that's a very different proposition than shutting down fossil fuels. And this is one of the things that I think became very clear to me during that period also, is that adding renewable energy to the grid does not actually solve climate change. What solves climate change is actually stopping the use of fossil fuels, which is a very different statement. Finding a replacement is a second piece of the puzzle, which would be great, which helps to sustain modern society. But the issue itself doesn't change unless you stop using fossil fuels. So a lot of what's happened over the last decade or so is, people have begun putting up solar PV farms, wind farms, but then they just build a fossil plant across the street to back it up. And so at the end of the day, just adding renewable energy itself does not actually solve the problem. And shutting down the use of fossil fuels is a very different proposition, in the sense that you're asking people to take a resource that is currently profitable and stop using it. You're asking people to effectively get rid of jobs. Now, granted, there could be some shift of jobs from one industry or one form of energy technology to another, but in it, on the face of it, it at the end of the day does result in the destruction of jobs. These are the kinds of phrases that are very, very able, don't play well in the American politics system. So um, I became quite clear that the only way we're really going to make a dent on this problem is the people have to demand um, differently on a policy level. Today, even fossil fuels are subsidized. So we're even paying to keep using fossil fuels. There are a lot of things that go on policy-wise that need to change, and the only way that that this system is set up for that to change is for the people to demand it and to elect officials and demand of the elected officials that exist uh, that the rules change. And so that is what sparked me thinking about, well, what contribution can I make towards that? Well, I think I'm in a decent position to at least help people get educated about it. And at the end of the day, people, there's the awareness issue of people being aware that this problem exists, that we have to demand different policies. And then there's the issue of people being educated about how it all works and knowing what to demand in the first place. So, we're in 2020. People have been talking about a carbon tax for a decade, and we still don't have a carbon tax. Like, very simple thing. And so there essentially needs to be a mass movement of the American people and globally to demand changes in policy, and a carbon tax is a great starting point. It in of itself is not enough. And so there's a lot of things that have to be done yesterday. And the goal of the series of videos and things I'm trying to do on social media is really to reach um, the layperson, the non-scientific specialist or expert, because we need the numbers, we need the people to demand it, and people have to get educated.
Well, again, your series does something else in addition to the educating component. It seems like you're also committed to dismissing misunderstanding. You're
Right.
committed to getting some of the mythology out of the way. So people have a lot of strange beliefs, even regarding COVID-19.
Right.
You did an excellent job in, and I hope we can show some of your video as well.
Mhm.
You did an excellent job in getting rid of some of the wrong notions, and they're still out there about COVID-19. So that's a big task.
Yeah. There are a number of, in my view, misconceptions that I'll just focus on Americans have about science and engineering. I think in the long run, these things filter in and they play into climate change and energy. Um, Particularly this notion that many Americans have, which is, if people saw the developments that happened um, in the microelectronics industry and in the internet boom, and there has been a growing sense amongst Americans that of this kind of phrase, well, you never know what someone will come up with next, right? And no matter how big the problem is or how complicated or difficult it may be, hey, maybe next year someone will invent something or create something that will change everything. And that sentiment is warranted for certain types of technologies, for electronics per se, where and it's actually interrelated with the physics of electronics and the fact that it's extremely low entropy. But when you start talking about energy technologies, the time scale to even deploy a new energy technology is on the scale of like 50 years. It takes us, half a century to switch a fuel to something else. Um, it was only a few years ago, within the last decade, that natural gas just overtook coal in production. It's taken that long. It's been around for a long time, yet just overtook coal. So us switching to another fuel, in this case renewables, something like solar and wind, will take a very long time. And these misconceptions people have about how easy it is, or what's the likelihood that someone will come with some miracle technology that will solve the problem and fix everything, um, are very much at the heart of some of the policy problems we have, because the expectations of new incumbent technologies are simply too high, and we're bounded by the laws of physics. You can't create or destroy energy. It's got to come from somewhere.
Okay,
uh,
but I'm going to challenge you a bit because
sure.
you've got great research going on. You're doing research to get rid of, and you can correct me if I get this wrong, the byproducts or the waste from the use of fossil fuels. You are looking at various ways of cleaning the atmosphere. So is that going to be a hard task, or maybe I'm one of those dreamers that think you've got a magic wand to
It's
wipe the mess out of the air?
it's an incredibly hard task. Um,
Okay.
and even with that hard task, there are rigid, immovable bounds on it. That's the part that I think is often not appreciated. So one could come up with a technology, but the cost of a technology is not some number that we get to make up. There are some rather what we call fundamental bounds on things like cost. For example, if you want to make a technology that's made out of a particular material, let's say you need to make it out of a piece of steel or whatever, or some iron, there is a fundamental limit on how cheap steel can ever be. And that comes from the fact that the steel requires energy to make it, to separate it from oxygen and the iron oxide that you get from the dirt from the ground. So there's no way around that energy. If you start with iron oxide and you want to extract iron, you've got to remove the oxygen. Chemically, it has to happen. No matter whether you've got some special catalyst to make it happen fast, the thermodynamics never changes. And the amount of energy required is fixed. It's just given based on the species you're dealing with. Those kinds of bounds are things that make it so that we cannot just do anything. We can do a lot, we can do certain things, but it is possible that the bound is actually above the cost of fossil fuels, right? See, with fossil fuels, you're able to take something straight from the ground, burn it, and put out something that's dangerous for the atmosphere without ever paying for it. So the fact that you can exhaust CO2 with zero, as an externality, with zero penalty, gives you an advantage, right? I mean, you don't have to pay for it. And so that aspect can play significantly into the possibility that you may never be able to find a technology that can undercut the cost of something that it can be wasteful without a cost, without a price on it. And so
sounds like you're describing almost an entire body of science that needs to be constructed to deal with this question, because it sounds like this is a general question for every science invention. Tell me about your sun in a box. What is that? You've actually invented something that I think could really serve humanity.
Sure, yeah, I mean, that's the technology that we are developing that I'm most excited about. To be clear, it's an energy storage technology, but even in that case, the time frame for it to be developed is likely a decade or more.
Okay,
right? Like,
but what is it?
But what it is
tell me what it is.
Sure, it's at the end of the day, in the most simplest terms, it's a new battery. It's a type of battery. The problem that it solves is that you get all that energy, but you don't necessarily get it when you want it or when you can use it. And one thing that it's important for people to appreciate about the grid is the grid does not actually have storage on it. Meaning the way your electricity works right now, the electricity coming out of your socket is oscillating and alternating current at 60 hertz. That 60 hertz is synchronized with the turbine spinning at 60 hertz. They're spinning at 3,600 RPM, and they're synchronized with your outlets. That's how a resource comes onto the grid. There's nothing in between to like hold some electricity until you're ready to use it and then give it to you later. It has to be made on demand. So there are people that sit and they actually try to predict how much electricity everybody's going to use tomorrow. They look at the weather, they look at how many people are going to turn on their air conditioners, and they make predictions, and they dispatch power plants based on what the expected needs are, and it's being managed in real time all the time. So what our technology attempts to do is create a energy storage technology that will actually be able to buffer energy on the grid. It really is agnostic to the source. It really doesn't matter whether it's solar or nuclear or wherever the energy comes from. And the reason it's so important is once you have the ability to store energy, you can allow resources like solar and wind onto the grid at higher, what we call penetrations, meaning more of the grid is made up of renewable energy. Right now, there's an intrinsic limit. Like, we literally can't have 50% of the grid be renewable. You'd shut down the grid, because anytime a cloud comes over, you'd see a huge dip in the amount of electricity, and people's lights would go off. You get brownouts all the time. And so instead, you need a resource that can sit in between, take in the electricity from the renewable resources as an unsteady stream, and then spit out a steady stream that exactly matches what people want to use and can take in feedback. So that's what our invention does. It does it in a way that is rather non-intuitive, which is why I think it's particularly exciting. Its main selling point is the fact that the cost is low. So this is not the first battery technology. Lithium-ion batteries exist. There's a bunch of different types of batteries that already exist. The problem with lithium-ion and all the existing technologies is cost. They simply cost too much to be able to solve this problem. So if you have solar panels, you add the cost of lithium-ion batteries, turns out the batteries are more expensive than the solar panels are. All right. There are a number of factors that come into this, one of which that is often not discussed well enough when people try to understand what's wrong with lithium-ion batteries. It's the lifetime. It's how long they last before they degrade and their output is no longer as high as it used to be. So you have to replace them. And so in our case, we've invented a technology that approaches this from a very different standpoint. What we're doing is going from electricity to heat back to electricity. And the reason that would sound stupid is because we expend most of our effort going from heat to electricity the first time. And when we do so, we pay a very big thermodynamic penalty. We lose generally more than half the energy. We waste it. So if you then now go electricity back to heat, you can do that at essentially almost 100% efficiency. The problem is when you go back from heat to electricity a second time, you're going to pay another big penalty, another 50%. So it sounds kind of dumb to do this, but I'll tell you why. The only reason we would ever do this is because the cost of storing heat is 100 times cheaper than storing electricity. So even though you pay another 50% penalty on efficiency, it's actually worth it. And it sounds very non-intuitive to say I'm going to throw that much energy away, but once the energy is cheap enough, it's actually more cost effective to throw some of it away and store it insanely cheaply than to try and actually save it and do that more expensively. So in essence, that's what we're doing. I'll skip this. This just kind of gives the fundamental argument for why it makes sense. But let me just walk you through this simple logic here, just so you can understand how cheap we're talking. If you imagine trying to store energy in something like liquid silicon, you take the heat capacity, cost of metallurgical grade silicon, which is about 98% pure, is about $1.50 a kilogram. Imagine you store the energy in the sensible heat of silicon, meaning you take silicon from one temperature, let's say it's already liquid, and you heat it up to another temperature that's 500 degrees hotter. You put in energy to do that, and then you can extract energy when you let it cool back down 500 degrees. So if you cycle it in that way, the amount of cost you would have per unit energy would come out at about $11 per kilowatt hour, but that's thermal energy. If your conversion is about 50% efficient, that's a factor of 2 higher than that. That's about $22 a kilowatt hour electric. Compare that with lithium-ion batteries, which are slated to maybe get to $150 a kilowatt hour electric. Pump hydro is at $75 a kilowatt hour electric. So this is very, very cheap energy storage. This is quite a bit lower than the cost of lithium-ion or other options. If you go to another thing like liquid iron, if you take scrap steel, you can get even cheaper than that. You can get down to $3, right? So you can store energy insanely cheaply if you store it thermally. And so this is the direction we've been looking at going. If you've never really thought about what happens with storing energy at large scales, this may not be obvious, but the first thing you might think is, if I put a cup of hot coffee on a table, it starts out hot, but an hour later it's going to be cooled down. Same thing would happen if you store heat. The heat is going to leak out and it's gradually going to cool down. However, the time scale, the time it takes for it to leak out is proportional. It's related to the surface area to volume ratio. So as you make a tank of something storing heat extremely large, this is order 10 meters in diameter, order 10 meters tall. It's got tens of thousands of tons of liquid salt inside. The time constant, the time it takes for this thing to cool down is on the order of months. So you can heat it up and it's not cooling down. You won't measure much of a temperature change like a week later, all right, because the volume is so large. So you can lose less than about 1% of the energy per day as long as you're cycling your battery pretty frequently. The heat leakage can be negligible. This is the part I wanted to mention about our atomic level insight. We'd like to store something like silicon. Silicon doesn't melt till 1400 degrees C. Iron melts at 1500 degrees C. This is so hot it's glowing white hot. If you imagine trying to store one of these elements in a tank made out of metal, it's not going to work. And generally it's not going to work because metals interact with other metals and they will form some kind of alloy, and so a metal will dissolve another metal. So imagine trying to store water in a tank made out of sugar, right? It's going to dissolve the walls, and very quickly the tank wall will go away, and all your sugary water will go everywhere. So our insight was, instead, we should be looking at materials where you take one of these elements and pair them with one of these elements so that you make a ceramic. If you do that, then you can actually form materials that are thermodynamically stable with respect to certain liquids, certain liquid metals. You can actually make something that has no chemical interaction and forms no corrosive byproducts if you start with a ceramic. So our key new idea that we brought here was the idea of doing liquid metal with a ceramic-based infrastructure. And ceramic-based infrastructure may sound difficult to make. It is, but we have overcome a lot of the challenges with doing that. What we want to use it for is an energy storage approach described here in this figure. It's going to sound insane when I talk about it, but we are building a prototype. Seems like it's going to work. So we bring in electricity from essentially any source you want. Doesn't matter whether it's renewable or not, but ideally we're focused on wanting to store renewable energy. Start with a tank of liquid silicon. This silicon is what we call our cold tank. But this tank is glowing white hot. It's at 1900 degrees C. When you are ready to charge your battery, you pump this liquid out, pump it past a bunch of heaters that are glowing white hot that are fueled by this electricity you want to store. The silicon heats up even more to about 2400 degrees C. This is about the temperature of an incandescent light bulb filament. So glowing white hot. So you store it in the hot tank. When you're now ready to get your electricity back, you can leave this liquid in here, for a while, weeks if you want. When you're ready to get the electricity back, you pump it out through this heat engine, and then you convert it back to electricity, and then it comes out cold and goes back in at 1900 degrees C. The heat engine is what's unique. The heat engine is different here. So it's not a turbine. Turbines can't operate this hot. Most metals will turn to liquid by this temperature. Instead, what we're using is photovoltaics as the heat engine. So what's happening here is we're actually converting some of the light that comes off of the infrastructure. All the pipes carrying that liquid are glowing white hot, and so we're scavenging the highest frequency light off of that that's being emitted, and we are converting that to electricity. These cells, these PV cells, are not normal. They've got mirrors on the back. So the majority of the light is actually light you can't see, which is infrared. We send that light right back to the infrastructure to keep it hot, and we preserve it. That's where the name sun in a box came from, is this idea that it's glowing white hot, and most of the light is trapped inside of this box, which is well insulated. So even though we don't convert most of the light on the first pass through the photovoltaic, we don't lose it. We use a mirror to reflect it back, and we keep it and preserve it, and we recycle it. Instead of storing energy electrochemically like you do in a battery, where there's essentially two species that want to react, and one gives up an electron in order to go through a membrane and to complete the reaction, here we're actually storing the energy thermally. So we can use very inexpensive, cheap, essentially recycled materials that actually are what's storing the energy. And because the materials themselves are so inexpensive, it drops the cost of the energy storage. Now, what's non-intuitive about it is we pay a very big penalty on the efficiency. So when electricity comes in, only about 50% of that electricity goes back out. We waste about half the electricity. So it's very wasteful in many respects, which is partly why this idea had not really been looked at very deeply, is because it's so wasteful and batteries are much more efficient. It didn't seem like it made sense. However, when you look at the cost, if you save a factor of 100 on cost, you only pay a factor of 2 or 50% on the efficiency. It ends up working out in the end. It's actually more cost effective to waste some of the energy and have a much cheaper form of storage than to be very expensive and have a higher efficiency. So
let me interrupt you and say this, because our audience is not made of scientists, it's made of all kinds of people.
Yes.
But I want to say that in listening to you, you've actually defeated your first answer. When I listen to you, I'm very hopeful because it sounds to me, because, I mean, people who watch me know I'm deep into science fiction as well. I enjoy that. I know it's fiction. But
Yeah.
I keep thinking now of a gigantic floating space station made up of your invention, not only capturing energy from the grid, but capturing energy from the sun in the same way you're describing. In the future, I mean, you'll probably, we can put that in the science fiction category. But you're making me very hopeful that some of our problems could be solved.
I
So
think,
I understand we don't want to make bad decisions based on thinking that way, which is a very good point. Now, you've got some T-shirts. Tell me about the T-shirts. Why would a busy scientist make T-shirts?
yeah. So the T-shirts are a recent idea as of maybe a month or so ago. And they are essentially an extension of um, an effort that a number of people were after me about for about a year and a half. Some people strongly suggested, they were like, well, there's so many people on social media that have these big followings and lots of people paying attention to them, and they are actually not experts in anything, and they're claiming to be. And you, on the other hand, actually are an expert, so you really need to have a social media following. And so in doing that, there's been a number of facets to it. There's the Ask a Real Scientist series, there's mini lessons, there's memes and different things that all act as content. But I wanted to also take it beyond social media, where it can affect people beyond just when they're in front of their phone or computer. And what I started to realize, and some of the feedback I've gotten on some of the things, is that there's really a cultural problem that we have, which is really something that I think is attributed to the younger generation of people that we have now, where there tends to be less of an emphasis on deep thought and careful consideration of ideas, and more of a whimsical acceptance of truths or ideas without real deep analysis. And so with that, the idea of the T-shirts is really to take this message that we need to go back to a day or a time or a culture where we think about these things very deeply, and we're very careful in what we say and what we do. We need to bring that back. And for all the people that stand with that notion, these T-shirts are for you. These T-shirts express ideas and thoughts that I have that I often never say to people. But I find that other people are having as well. They think it to themselves, and a T-shirt is a nice way of saying it without having to offend people in a way. A lot of it was actually, I'll tell you, there was actually a T-shirt by Nike that kind of sparked the idea for me. There was a T-shirt that I absolutely hated, and I used to see kids wearing it. It said talented but lazy, and I used to think to myself, who would wear that? Why would you be proud of being lazy? And I used to find myself in a position where I'm like, there aren't any T-shirts with messages that I feel like I can get behind that I would wear. And I wanted to make something that I would want to wear.